and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this.
Oh,
So,
be here.
yeah, it's good to see you. And welcome very, very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Anthony Arnove, and he's the author of a book that's out now. I want to show what it looks like right at the very beginning. It's titled Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal, and you can see how it would look in the bookstores and so forth. It's a really very well written, very well researched and accurate account of the situation here in 2006, August 22nd thereof. And he's also been the co-editor of the Voices of the, again, help me out with
Voices of a People's History of the United States.
With the eminent Howard Zinn. I congratulate you on that. And he's had an illustrious career as a writer, editor, and so forth. And welcome very much to Conversation.
Thanks for having me.
My great good pleasure. Great praise for the book. It's really very good. But I wonder, maybe you could. We got 58 minutes. Maybe you could share a little bit of your own personal background, where you were born and raised, a little of education, that sort of thing. Then we'll get into discussing the substance of this book.
Sure. I was born in California, but only lived there very briefly before my parents moved to Bogota, Colombia.
Oh, really?
And I was there for 3.5 years before they then moved to Bloomington, Indiana.
Boy, you follow me, because I was in Medellin, Colombia for 6 months, did a master's thesis there, and then I went to Bloomington, Indiana to do my doctoral work. So we're following each other around.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
So Bloomington via Columbia, and then I grew up in Bloomington and lived there, except for one brief year in California, until the time when I went off to college.
I see.
Where I went to Oberlin College in Ohio.
Yes.
For my undergraduate work, and then from there went and did a PhD at Brown University.
And you did the undergraduate and graduate work in history, or in?
My undergraduate work was actually in literature, and then in my graduate work in literature and also in media studies.
I see.
So study of modern culture and media.
Remember well the movie Breaking Away?
Of course.
What a fantastic, I loved Bloomington. It was really great. They had a barber shop with an old yellow dog, and it was just great.
Yeah, it's a great town.
It is, yeah, it is. Anyway, you've done that, and you're also, you have a political view of the world in a very real sense that it permeates your writing and so forth. You write with Z Magazine, and you write for Socialist Review and that sort of thing. Maybe share a little of that, your own predisposition as far as your political view of the world.
Well, both of my parents were involved in the movement against the Vietnam War and in the civil rights movement. My mother was involved in the Southern civil rights movement, and then they were involved in the Vietnam anti-war movement when they met in California. So I grew up around social justice concerns, and my dad's profession was teaching in the School of Education at Indiana University.
I see.
So a lot of his students were international students, and I was exposed at a young age to a number of political concerns that I might not otherwise have been exposed to.
Yeah.
One of our neighbors was Kurdish, for example.
Really?
So
that's interesting.
I learned at a young age about the oppression of the Kurds in Turkey and Iran and in the Middle East. Also, we had Palestinian, Arab neighbors, friends, family. So I learned some of those stories at an early age. So I think I was politically aware at a young age. I went to a college, Oberlin, that had a social justice tradition. It's one of the first schools to admit women and African Americans in the same program.
When would that have been?
Oh, well, that would have been in the early part of the 19th century.
Early part of the 19th century. Yeah.
And
that was in Ohio, is it?
In Ohio.
Yeah.
And northern Ohio, no, actually
that's Antioch, is it? Yellow Springs, another important
Absolutely.
school. Yeah.
This is in Oberlin near Cleveland, about half an hour outside of Cleveland.
Okay.
And so I was, at the time that I was in college, the 1991 Gulf War took place.
Yeah.
I organized against that. I brought Professor Noam Chomsky from MIT to speak at the campus during the conflict. And I think that's where I became more seriously involved in activism and began to see it not just as kind of a single issue concern, but part of a broader project of social change and transformation, and that it wasn't going to just be a minor part of my life, but it was going to be really a central part of my life.
And your central part of your life came to have a view of the human condition and some of the means by which that might be improved in a maximal way for everybody in a justice and maybe even an efficient and maybe even a historically necessary direction that things are going to move that sometimes are hard to see.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I began, for example, in college I read a book by Howard Zinn called The People's History of the United States.
Great book, yeah.
Which is fabulous. And in that book I encountered Eugene Debs. Now, even though I'd grown up in Indiana, not too far from Terre Haute, where Debs lived, and there's now a Debs museum if you ever get a chance.
He was Terre Haute?
Yeah, he
Why
was in
do I
Terre Haute.
associate Debs with Wisconsin?
Well, there was a strong socialist movement in Wisconsin,
I see, yeah.
but Debs lived in Indiana most of his life.
Didn't realize.
And died in Indiana. There's a museum to him there.
Okay.
And he first joined the Railroad Workers Union in Indiana. So he had a rich connection there. He ran for president 5 times.
Yes.
He was a very important historical figure.
On a socialist ticket.
Absolutely, as a socialist, including one time from prison.
Really? That's...
And he never was taught in our public school education in Indiana. So then here I am.
How would he taught himself? He was autodidactic?
No, what I'm saying, sorry, is I never learned about
I see what you mean.
studying in public school in Indiana.
Right.
You know, I learned about Davy Crockett.
Yeah.
Spent a week in Indiana or something, but not Debs, who was this towering figure. And I was really struck by the eloquence of his analysis, his socialist politics, which I encountered in Howard Zinn's work for the first time, and that began a kind of course of study in learning the history of the socialist movement in this country, and ultimately coming to see myself as a socialist.
And you do now see yourself in the socialist tradition.
Absolutely.
Help me out, then, if you can, because we've had this evolving thing going on. We had the great confrontation, the twilight struggle that they called against the Soviet Union, which called itself socialist. And socialism has been used as a political context for many revolutionary movements and so forth. They would revile against the imperialists and that kind of a view of things. Marxian, the distinction between socialist and Marxian, where is that to be drawn, and what is the difference, and how do we deal with that, and is it important now that Francis Fukuyama has written his book, It's the End of History, because we defeated the Soviet Union, so socialism is now in the dustbin of history. Maybe you could put some of that way of thinking to rest here.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that the Soviet Union and what it really came to represent was something that was antithetical to socialism.
Okay.
It was a dictatorship. It was based on the ideas of Joseph Stalin, which were a complete break from the socialist tradition. And really, it was necessary to crush the generation of people who made the Russian Revolution of 1917 on a very democratic principle, and very democratic basis of the idea of working class people getting greater control over their lives, running the society democratically. He instituted a one-party dictatorship, crushed democracy, crushed dissent, and created this idea of socialism in one country, which is nonsense. Socialism is based on the idea of international cooperation, international sharing of resources, production based on need rather than based on profit. And it's based on ordinary people controlling their own circumstances and lives democratically. It's basically the difference between socialism from above and some kind of imposed order from above.
Would the socialism you're thinking of be associated with Trotsky?
It would be associated with Trotsky's critique of Stalinism and the Soviet Union. Trotsky's effort to keep alive the idea of socialism at a time when parties around the world said that Stalin was the model. But also before that, with the seeds of the Russian Revolution of 1917, the seeds of human experimentation that we saw in the Paris Commune of 1871, the workers' councils in Spain that were set up in the 1930s as a challenge to the fascists, where workers began to manage the factories themselves, run things themselves.
Yeah, Barcelona, one thinks so. And
absolutely.
Madrid, there was a movement there, and so that's it. So the idea that the struggle, socialism, the significance of Karl Marx to the idea of socialism, or Marxism as it's sometimes called.
Well, I think Marx is central to the socialist tradition.
Okay.
And his views have been completely distorted. because people came to say that Marx led to Stalin, led to the gulags of the
led to
Soviet
what's
Union,
going on in China now?
or led to China, or North Korea, or
Yeah.
any number of other states that have claimed the mantle of socialism, but have had nothing to do with either socialist tradition or with what Marx wrote about. If you read the Communist Manifesto, which is quite relevant to the world we live in today, even though it's more than 150 years old now,
Yeah.
it ends with a phrase that in a true socialist society, the vast majority will rule in the interest of the vast majority, and we will live in a society which is a free association, in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all.
That's a good idea.
Very good idea.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with what Stalin was doing in the Soviet Union. So actually, I welcome the collapse of the Stalinist regimes. I think it cleared away a brutal, undemocratic model, and it creates the beginnings of the ground of challenging people like Fukuyama and others who said socialism is dead, to revive a genuine democratic tradition of socialism from below, to go back to the roots of that tradition, to clear away all the muck of Stalinism, and to talk about why Marx's ideas are so relevant today. A world where, like, just take the United States, the world's richest country, and yet more than 44 million people without health insurance. Inequality is growing, not only
It is rapidly.
within countries rapidly, but amongst countries. Certain countries are developing so much more rapidly than others that you now have more than 2 billion people on this planet living on less than $1 a day.
That many? That's a third.
Yeah. And every day,
less than $1 a day.
every day, people dying of diseases that could have been easily prevented. Diseases of poverty, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people every year dying from these diseases that could be wiped out immediately. We have the resources, we have the technology. It's
and
just
we have
not
the knowledge.
profitable. We have the knowledge.
We have the
it's just not profitable to do it.
Yeah, we have the capability. It's very frustrating to have a capability, hard-won, knowledge, research, that sort of thing, to take care of a problem that our historically inherited institutions and views of things won't allow us to do what we collectively know we're capable of doing to serve the human society, maybe even within a larger ecological context, and our systems won't allow us to do what we're capable of doing. It's sort of schizophrenia.
It is.
And it's creating a great deal of tension when the gap between our capability and what we're able to realize is being realized by greater numbers of people every day as things muddle on through, don't you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And you mentioned ecology.
Yeah.
The current economic system we have, capitalism, it's a global system, based on profit, based on short-term calculation of profit, that is leading to ecological destruction because it can't factor in the environment. It can't factor in the human consequences.
Externalities,
Yeah,
they call
that's
it,
what
right?
they call it.
Yeah.
So they, factor that out.
Right.
Meanwhile, you're destroying the basis of human life on the planet. In terms of just simple things like global warming, what we're doing to the oceans, what we're doing to the air, what we're doing to the trees, what we're doing to the human environment. But moreover, the economic competition, which is inherent in capitalism, it's built into capitalism, glorified by capitalism, inevitably leads to military competition. So that kind of military competition, once you factor in the fact that we've taken the technology that could be used to help feed people, clothe people, house people, give people meaningful lives, creative, fulfilling lives, instead we've taken that technology and used it to develop weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, nuclear weapons, that could destroy the planet many, many times over.
That's a very important existential, significant matter in terms of our lifetime, is it not?
Absolutely.
That we've crossed an existential significant line in terms of destructive capability that now is in our midst.
There's no question about it. And the United States has used nuclear weapons, used them twice in Japan, and they're now trying to lower the bar to the use of nuclear weapons by creating a new generation of what they call mini nukes.
Is that the third generation, mini nuke bunker busters or something, so
Absolutely.
you can get to Osama in his cave or something?
And the idea is, oh, well, it's a nuclear weapon, but it's a small nuclear weapon. It's a tactical nuclear weapon, so somehow it's okay to use it.
I don't know if you knew, Henry Kissinger wrote a very significant book in 1954 on tactical nuclear weapons, which was a topic then, and it seems to be revisited. I wonder if we can come back a little bit more to the historical context. The Soviet Union, we had a twilight struggle. We had George Kennan. We had containment. the so-called free world that claims legitimacy historically, and is still claiming legitimacy historically. We had that against the Soviet Union and then China after 1948. There was a great, we fought the commies, or the communists as they were called, even though many would see those both as state capitalist systems that were developing and so forth, gated communities, and plutocratic leadership element like everywhere. So, but we had that, and that was a problem. And we had a system of thinking that containment, we were going to contain that. We fought a war in Vietnam on the other side of the Eurasian landmass that we're now fighting, it seems, in Vietnam. And I wonder if there's any against that, and we contained that. And now, when after 1989, in the minds of many, that came apart, that dialectic with this so-called enemy presence on the earth, which is the socialist communist system, like a red amoeba coming out from the Eurasian landmass, fell apart. We didn't have a traditional enemy like we have. And do you think that's relevant, the things that followed after 1989, to try and figure in to how we're casting about for an element that we can have dialectic opposition to in the form perhaps of, they're called terrorists now, or Arab terrorists or something, but maybe put some of those things in perspective from your perspective.
No question that since 1989, the United States has been looking for a new external threat to replace the communist threat. Now we now have the declassified records from much of that period of the Cold War, and we know that the stated rationale for the need to contain or even to roll back the communist states was much different than the internal discussion. So publicly there was all this talk about threat of invasion or attack or assault, but if you now go back and look at the internal discussion, there was an exaggeration of
among
deliberate,
the power elite,
absolutely, among people in the Kennedy administration, Johnson administration, deliberate exaggeration of the threat, deliberate exaggeration of the size of the enemy military and so on, in order to have a propaganda value, to justify military spending, to justify military intervention, and so on. But setting that aside for a moment, with the collapse of that order, the collapse of that pretext, the United States needed a new rationale for projecting its power globally, for sending troops abroad, for maintaining military bases, for maintaining the North Atlantic Treaty Association Alliance, NATO, because the rationales for many of those things were that they were needed to contain the Soviet Union. Well, Soviet Union's gone. How do you keep those foreign bases? How do you keep up the military spending? How do you keep up the right of the United States to just go in and march into other countries and topple their governments or to rain down missiles upon them? You need a new rationale. And so the United States engaged in a series of imperial adventures, let's call them.
Yeah, the Marxists would call them imperialists.
Absolutely, they were imperialists.
They call themselves globalizing neoliberal forces for good or something, but...
Yeah, they have all kinds of rhetoric because, you know, rarely does a state say, we're going to invade another country because we want to dominate its people, we want to make their markets open to our goods, we want to take their natural resources, we want to have military bases in their country, we don't like the government, we want one that's friendlier to us, and we don't care what the people think.
They say we're bringing democracy.
We're liberating them, we're bringing democracy, we're fighting for free markets.
And historical legitimacy is on our side. We represent the historically legitimate international consensus, and we have these few rogue people that we really have to contain.
Exactly. Just like the British did when they were the colonial power of the world.
Sounds the same, doesn't it?
Just like the French did when they, just like the Belgians, just like... This is not unique to the U.S. It's a history of colonialism and imperialism.
Rome was pretty good.
The United States just happens to be now a unique superpower, and that it is a single superpower.
Yeah, hyperpower, the French call it.
The hyperpower, as the French call it, that has extraordinary economic and military advantage against its potential competitors, more than any other empires had in history.
That's a very interesting point to keep in mind. And we did exercise that, if I may. We're going to play a program next... Vietnam. We exerted force there, and the analogies may be there to be drawn with the Vietnam. We got there, we had a Tonkin resolution thing. We put troops in, we ended up with 58,000 American men and women of the military decimated. and then something on the order of 4 million Southeast Asians that died as a result of that incursion on our part to fight the commies in what Mr. McNamara in The Fog of War says was a mistake.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that I noticed is no one has ever gone in the dock for killing 4 million people. It just seems to be brushed aside in a way that winks at the moralists and will say, if you're strong, you can get away with murder. You're
Sure.
above the law and the international law, and the only thing that matters is a Darwinistic, laissez-faire, power might makes right kind of view of the world, and that's still operative in terms of the reality that operates on this planet?
There's no question might makes
Okay.
right.
Okay.
International law is a
Yeah.
plaything of the powerful countries.
It is. They write the history and the current context of what is supposedly legitimate.
Absolutely, and we
Okay.
can see that with regard to Iraq. For example, Saddam Hussein was an ally and friend of the United States. The United States armed him, protected him diplomatically, befriended him, helped him rise to power in Iraq, helped the Ba'ath Party that he was a member of rise to power, helped him crush the secular opposition in Iraq, delivered weapons to him, protected him as he was carrying out the worst crimes in terms of poisoning, using chemical weapons, poison gas against the Kurdish population.
Against the Kurds.
Against the
Is
Kurds.
that Halabja?
In Halabja in 1988, but that was part of a larger campaign called the Anfal campaign. At the time, the United States knew about it. Not only did the United States say nothing to Saddam Hussein, critically slap him on the wrist even, they increased agricultural credits to him. They tried to blame the Iranians for the attacks to try to shift attention away from Saddam Hussein.
There was some question of that. There was a CIA report that the gas came from Iranian sources and at Halabja. There were reports that, I don't know if it was a false screen thing or something that was put out.
They were trying to do whatever they could to minimize the disaster, not to have Saddam Hussein held accountable. Go back and read the press at the time. Very little attention or outrage or notice of it at all.
Hard to keep track of our machinations because he was with us and then we're against him and then we're against him and then Alec Glasby brought him into 91. It's a real Byzantine kind of experience we had with them. I saw Jude Winniski. I don't know if you know Jude Winniski, he's a supply side fellow. But he said at one point, he said he didn't quite know why Saddam was in the dock at all. Well, he said the casus belli, there was slant drilling, that sort of thing, and that he was sort of like, he kept the Union together like Tito.
Well, the thing is,
maybe even a more heavily drawn thing, Abraham Lincoln was vastly hated by people in the time he held this Union together. And if you had somebody along the lines of Wilkes Booth talking about Lincoln in his time, it would have been something like what Chalabi and others were saying about Saddam Hussein. It may have been way overrated in order to follow some sort of a political agenda of other people. I don't know if that figures or not.
Well,
that he wasn't that
he
bad.
He was an ally of the United States as he was carrying out horrible crimes. I mean, we should not minimize what happened in Halabja or Anfal or how repressive that government was.
Not 35 million.
But he was...
It wasn't 35 million.
No, of course it wasn't 35
million. No, that's
million.
what I'm trying to say. It's the kettle calling the
I understand, but there's a lesson here, which is his crimes were acceptable when he was an ally of the United States.
Yeah,
they were sponsored. Right. Then, when he invaded Kuwait and threatened to destabilize the Middle East, and in the context that we were talking about earlier...
He had been lured into it, perhaps?
Well, let's set that aside. Okay. That's perhaps a conspiracy theory. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. We don't have firm evidence of it.
April Glasby?
They had a meeting... where they certainly didn't send a strong signal of, we're going to crush you if you go into Kuwait. So that's clear.
A week in the nod, go ahead.
But whether or not it was a trap that he fell into or not, he went into Kuwait in the context that we were talking about earlier, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the United States looking to assert its power globally and looking for new rationales. And the idea that Saddam Hussein had gotten too big for his britches and our ally was now destabilizing the region, had done something that was seen as antithetical to our interests, a region that has 2/3 of world oil supplies. He had to be He had to be put in check. And now all of a sudden his human rights abuses mattered. Now all of a sudden the crimes that we had sponsored were trotted out to explain why he was an evil dictator.
They can turn on the PR water on and off,
So that's the important lesson there. And then the use of power in Iraq becomes a precedent. It becomes it has what's called a demonstration effect, meaning we've demonstrated we're the sole superpower. We'll call the shots. We don't need the United Nations. We don't need other countries. We'll do what we need to do.
You mean in 91?
In 1991.
Well, George Bush the Senior had built an alliance of people. Even Syria and others came in on that. So it was a little bit more adroit diplomatically than what we're experiencing now.
It was absolutely a little more adroit diplomatically.
But still the same pathway.
But still the same basic pattern of we'll go it alone. If other people want to help us out and help pay the bill, great. But we're not going to be bound by international law. We're not going to be bound by the United Nations. We're going to set up a new framework of international order. It was called the New World Order by George Bush Sr. But at any rate, it ushered in a period where we saw a developing of this kind of bogeyman, really, of the Arab threat, and increasingly moving towards the model of choosing to replace the communist threat with the Islamic threat, with the Arab threat, and focusing our energy on that part of the world.
That's interesting. I wonder if you could, maybe since it's, we're coming out of a thing now, the neocons who did that, I think Wolfowitz was writing things about attacking Iraq back in the 70s. They were targeting that. Iraq was a large population, relatively large population, that had oil. Saudi Arabia's small population, not oil. But Iraq were also very well known for being fierce fighters in terms of a military context. And the neocon people who were advising and finally getting the strong support of Mr. Bush and so forth were, was the interest of Israel by the neocon, would the Likudnik or the right-wing view of Israel, seeing Iraq as a threat to Israel? They did bomb the reactor in 1981. Is the interest of Israel that we've aligned ourselves with so completely in the modern experience been part of the equation that prompted many of those neocon hawks to think, let's decimate or break up Iraq because it would become a threat not only to us, American interests over the world, but particularly to our tried and true ally, Israel? Is there a tie there, or what do you think?
Well, I think in the main, the policy has been driven by U.S. interests, not by Israeli interests.
Oil.
And the main interest has been oil.
Oh.
Now, there's an alignment of U.S. and Israeli interests, but that's not driving the policy. The real thing driving the policy is, since World War II, even before the creation of the State of Israel, the United States has understood that oil is central to the world capitalist economy, that oil is also central to the operation of military. So it's fundamental to the U.S. economy, it's fundamental to the U.S. military and to U.S. empire, and that the United States would seek to replace the British and the French, who were the main colonial powers in the region, as the dominant outside power. It would guarantee the flow of oil on terms that were favorable to U.S.-based and Western-based corporations, and it would control in that region regimes that might destabilize the flow of oil. So it would contain Arab nationalism, movements like Nasser's movement. It would overthrow a popular government like Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. He was overthrown 2 years after he nationalized Iran's oil and said, this oil should go to develop Iran and help its people, not
subversive thinking.
Exactly.
Yes.
So the U.S. has long, Republican, Democrat, neocon, neoliberal, it doesn't matter. That's been axiomatic, central position of U.S. foreign policy. Carter had the Carter Doctrine. We will militarily engage anyone who threatens the flow of energy resources from the Middle East. That was central to his administration's foreign policy thinking. So this isn't a neocon thing. It's not a new thing. It's an old thing. There's continuity here. But what happened is a couple of things in the equation shifted. Iran in 1979 went from being a state that was run by a brutal dictator, the Shah of Iran, who was allied with and loyal to the United States, repressing his own population. That government, which came out of the overthrow of Mossadegh and brutalized its own population, they lost control of Iran in 1979. Then they began to lose control of Iraq in 1991 when Saddam Hussein, emboldened by all the years of support that he had been given by the United States got a little too big for his britches and aspired to a greater regional role than the United States wanted him to play. Then, after the 1991 Gulf War, the United States lost its military bases in Saudi Arabia. Remember that we had military bases
They're going
there.
to Qatar now.
They moved to Qatar. So now you're in a situation where the United States is in a weaker position in the region than it wants to be.
Right.
So it's looking for an excuse. It's looking for an opportunity, and they thought that Iraq was a weak government, an unpopular government that could be easily overthrown.
Listening to Mr. Chalabi and company.
Exactly. Believing the lies of these Iraqi exiles who haven't lived in the country in decades, who themselves were hoping to run the country.
It's like talking to John Wilkes Booth about the character of Abraham Lincoln.
and then they thought that they would be able to set up military bases in Iraq, get the oil flowing on terms favorable to the United States, and then by having its position in Iraq, project power in the region. Regime change in Iran, regime change in Syria. This whole project, what's called the Greater Middle Eastern Project.
Greater Eastern, that's for, the project for a new century.
And then, if you're the dominant player in energy policy
and
politics
the
in the
world.
Middle East, you can project your power globally. Because look, the United States only brings in 14% of its oil.
Japan gets 85%, I think.
85, 90%.
That was
China gets its oil. India gets its
energy. And those markets are growing.
The European Union gets its energy from that part of the world. And so you have a lever against competing economic powers, competing political powers, competing military powers, and you can prevent the emergence, ideally this is the goal, to prevent the emergence of future rival states, not just
rival states outside the area,
for example,
or you can
looking
put
down
the pressure to China and so forth.
China, India,
or India,
the European Union,
and
so on.
Or in general, it would be a carrying on of the general white man's burden that we had in the 19th century, that it was a European's destiny, manifest destiny to control the world, to keep, as it would put derisively, the wogs in line. They called them wogs in the Middle East, they called them gooks, but it's the
and they call them hajis today in Iraq.
Hajis, is that what they call them?
That's what they train the U.S. soldiers to call them, hajis, to dehumanize them and degrade them.
Towel heads, that kind of thing.
Just as they were taught to call the Vietnamese gooks for the same reason.
They do that, and they have that attitude. And one thing we should realize, perhaps we're looking at things, is that that's the way a great deal of the world, after all, who remembers historically, like many of the African Americans remember very well slavery, which existed in this country and much of the world, and much of the world remembers the boot of European colonialism in the name of advancing civilization as a legitimate order. And that's some dialectic that we should very well understand, whether it's in Vietnam or in Iraq or Lebanon.
Iraq was occupied by the British. I have a chapter in the book that talks about the British occupation. When the British marched into Baghdad, they said, we come here as liberators, not as occupiers.
That's what they always say.
Imagine,
I think the Romans said the same, didn't they?
Of course. But imagine then when the United States comes in and says the very same phrase, we come as liberators, not as occupiers.
They have military forces in something like 130 countries, I believe, permanent bases.
They have more, from what I understand. Chalmers Johnson has done very serious research on this, and in his book Sorrows of Empire, he documents the number of countries in which there are military bases. I believe it's now more than 130 countries, but at any rate,
there's only 189 in the world, 191, I think, countries. We got. Well, I guess there's a couple countries in the Pacific Islands or something that escaped our maul. Is that the possibility? But it is really overwhelming, and it's an arrogance of power that is exerted by that.
Tremendously
arrogant. We mentioned the Qatar, that they just had the Emir, or the head of Qatar, was just on the television. It was reported yesterday or 2 days ago, and he came on much to the chagrin of Washington and of the world, and he said, instead of joining in on the war on Hezbollah, he sang highly the pleasure, the success and the victory of Hezbollah in Lebanon against Israel. And he said that it's breathed a new opposition to Israel, which has been there constantly for a long time, and it caused a great deal of shudders in Washington and other places, that there may be a breathing of new life rather than a moribund kind of acceptance of the Western imperialist influence over that part of the world, and that it is through the the intimidation and the lack of invincibility that the Israeli IDF and so forth had been able to exert against Arafat and so forth, that it's breathing new life into an Arab-based resistance against Western imperialism. What do you think of that?
Well, there's always been a contradiction in the Middle East between a number of Arab governments that have been aligned with the United States, that in effect have been client states of the United States.
That's what we would want them to be. That's what we call a moderate reasonable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even though they're dictatorships that are beheading their own citizens, crushing dissent, don't allow trade unions, don't allow free press, don't allow women the vote, or so on, they're called moderate. But countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Jordan, countries like Egypt, countries like the United Arab Emirates have in effect been willing client states of the United States because they formed a security partnership with the United States. They formed an economic partnership where a handful of elites at the top of those states benefit from that relationship with the main imperial power.
As does a handful of elites benefit in every political entity in this world, including the United States of America, I notice.
Exactly.
We live in a plutocratic world. We should stop talking about democracy, because we certainly do not. We have a truncated democracy in terms of voting, which has some ability, but we definitely have an economic oligarchic plutocracy in every country in the world, including the international order as well.
Absolutely.
The system that we're asked to live in is not nearly available to us. What the future requires, or perhaps allows now in a new kind of way, that the socialist dream, among others, might promise, and maybe this new shift in the power balance against your pure realpolitik, arms and so forth, is being challenged in a way to make an opportunity for there to be a view of the world that is appropriate to liberating, perhaps to use an overworked term, the human capability and so forth within the socialist ideal. Do you think?
I certainly hope so.
Yeah.
There's no guarantees in history.
Yeah.
But you can see right now tremendous contradiction. You can see how the direction we're going in is completely unsustainable.
You feel that?
Is leading to more and more suffering and harm.
Yeah.
And you see that the claims for the system ring more and more hollow. So I do think, see more and more people wanting an alternative. What form that alternative will take, there's no guarantee, but
well,
there's
there
the
could
possibility.
be question about that. That's why I wanted to start talking about socialism and so forth, because that's thought of by a great deal of what we call, the left and so forth. That's been a dream and so forth. I happen to have a different kind of view and so forth. I have a guy named Louis Kelso wanted to spread ownership, and Muammar Gaddafi spreads ownership, private capital ownership, instead of it being contained in a small class, can be disseminated widely among the general population. Might be the same, two different roads to get to a place where we have a system that really is just and also efficient in terms of liberating our full potentiality. That's a question that's still there and something to be reserved. But that we don't get anything of that in terms of our political leadership. They get no vision. And I was saying to you off camera, I was very dismayed when I viewed our president talking about we're going to stay the course in Iraq. I saw him on the television last night. I was I don't know, maybe he was tired, but it was very dismaying that he was really unhinged.
Yeah,
and I'm very worried about that. I'm wondering if they shouldn't have, with 10,000 atomic weapons, shouldn't have some sort of a stringent sanity test or something put down upon our leaders, because they have in their hands the ability to apparently wipe out our whole species, and I've got 4 grandchildren now.
Absolutely.
I'm very concerned about...
I think the reason, though, he's unhinged is a political reason.
Yeah, it's coming home to roost.
His policy is more and more unpopular. His presidency is more and more unpopular. A majority of people in this country now think it was a mistake to have invaded and occupied Iraq. It's plainly made the world a more dangerous place, not a safer place, as we were told. It's plainly not been an occupation that's liberated the Iraqi people. It's brought them destruction and devastation of their society. And so more and more people are reaching the conclusion that we should get out of there. That rather than, quote-unquote, staying the course, we should abandon a reckless, dangerous course, which is destroying Iraq, and which is producing more and more enmity in the world against the United States.
There may be hope in the enmity, because it's finally building to a point where it would have some... It's like, you're too young to remember Ev Dirksen. Ev and Charlie show, he used to be in the Congress, and he said $1 billion, he was talking about budget, billion here, $1 billion, it finally adds up to real money. You know,
Yeah.
it was a kind of joke. It's finally building up to where there's going to be the possibility of perhaps questioning, as is so often accepted. You've got many people who are sycophant to a system that seems to be in order. They were so in the Roman times because there are interests, economic interests and so forth. They can be bought off. Best democracy money can buy. Greg Palast will tell us that sort of thing. They can be bought off by what seems to be the legitimate order. But there's beginning to be rumblings about the claim to legitimacy of the Western-led, Western power, the United States of America and its and allies and plutocratic running dogs, as some people might call them around the world, that the supposed legitimacy of that order that they're trying to impose upon the world is coming to be questioned by a greater and greater number of very strongly motivated people with great enmity directed at this visionless kind of system that's being perpetrated upon the world. Do you think it may be leading to where there could be a real challenge to the legitimacy claims that they have in order to maybe start
But the challenge can take different forms,
Okay.
and I don't think we should minimize that part of what the U.S. occupation of Iraq has done is to fuel reactionary movements. That is, movements that don't have an agenda of spreading democracy and human liberation, but have a very reactionary set of politics that have a different explanation for why things are so wrong in this world and how to fix them.
Right.
And it's different than our vision. So in some ways, it might make some of our work a little bit harder in the short term, because you know, in times of economic and political crisis, it's not always that the left benefits. Sometimes the right benefits.
They hardly ever. It seems to me like a long, long trail of winding up Mount Sisyphus.
You have situations where, you know, sometimes fascist movements can be emboldened, and
I've
they have
noticed.
their own explanation.
Or
it's a wrong
state
explanation.
capitalism,
Or state capitalism, or
communism run amok with apparatchiks.
So I think we have to be sober about our challenges, and then I also think we have to distinguish between who benefits and who does not benefit. That's an important germ of what you were getting at, because it's not the case that most people in this country are being bought off by empire. The reality is the empire has the same disregard for people in this country as it has for the Iraqi people.
It's
Look at
becoming
Hurricane
more
Katrina.
evident. Yeah.
Right?
That
I mean,
was
it's a very concrete
that's
moment.
But I'm saying that's part of the general thing where I think there's being worrying that they don't have a vision and people are getting wise to it, perhaps.
Right.
Maybe that's dreaming too wide, but things are going on, particularly, it would seem to me, after this situation in Lebanon.
Yes, well, look, there was a...
They were firing rockets
Katrina,
into Haifa right until the last day of the thing, and now the head of Qatar and other countries and around the world, and then we got Iran. We got a little clip we wanted to show the president of Iran, that they are now taking a very strong review about, rather than trying to be, that's a client state, Qatar. And he's singing the praises of Hezbollah and Nasrallah.
Well,
so there's something blowing in the wind against Israel.
Which is a puppet government
of
the United States,
it's
also criticized the Israeli incursion into Lebanon.
They had 100,000 or something.
And there was demonstrations in Iraq. So look, there's no question that the United States made a terrible gamble in encouraging Israel to go into Lebanon.
They thought
They've now done it twice. They did it in Iraq. They've thrown the dice and lost. And then they thought, we're losing in Iraq, so somehow maybe we can strengthen our position by using Israel as a proxy to invade Lebanon.
Israel would
and
be
beyond that, they were seeking to challenge Syria and Iran.
And as Israel always had done, they could mop up on the wogs.
But
they
as
could
it turned
beat them
out,
into,
the
and
opposite
now
happened.
it's gone the opposite. So that's a double thing. And what's that doing is creating a new geopolitical reality, perhaps, against the assumed legitimacy. In one case, the most immediately vulnerable is Israel. I think it's very, they're all, you know, that's the thing. And by doing that, why do we send so much money, Apache helicopters, and support Israel? Is that in the national interest for us to do that? I saw the people, Holbrook, the other day saying that's an absolute linchpin of our whole geostrategic structure in the world is the support of Israel, and one begins to question why.
Yeah.
Why are we supporting Israel with Apache helicopter, $3 billion a year, I think, a year? Why are we doing that? If you start questioning that, you're questioning an alliance that could then start bringing a questioning of the legitimacy of the power behind that, the United States, which seems out of keeping with what historically has been the case. We're just going to mop up on the world and whip the wogs into shape.
Yeah, but look at you know, the cost of the war in Iraq. That's now, the indirect economic costs were recently estimated by Joseph Stiglitz at Columbia University at $1.6 trillion. That's up to this point. He says if the occupation continues, as every indication is that it will,
despite your very good book, which is highly recommended, I'd like to put it up so people can see it again. The case for immediate withdrawal from Iraq, and I don't know. Well, go ahead, keep talking. I'll hold it up, and you can come in on this.
Well, I'll just say that he estimates that the cost could rise to $2.6 trillion. That's just the indirect and direct costs of the Iraq operation.
That's about what we give every year to Israel.
Well, no. This is trillion.
I know, trillion.
No, we give billions.
Yeah, you're right.
All
right. You're right.
So
I'm sorry.
a whole 100 order of magnitude.
That's
greater.
right. Yeah, it's like F. Dirksen, a billion here, a billion there. It adds up to real money.
Add in the costs of the
Yeah.
expanding Pentagon budget.
Right.
Add in the Energy Department budget, which goes to nuclear weapons.
Right.
Add in the secret part of the Pentagon budget for foreign military operations. Add in the CIA and Department of Defense,
added the
kind of black
attacks
ops
on
budget.
civil liberties in this country.
Add
and
in the attacks on civil liberties.
Yeah.
And in community after community in this country, you have cuts in social spending, cuts in funding for libraries, for job programs, for veterans programs, for basic social services that are vital to ordinary people, and yet more and more money for war, for empire. Absolutely, there's connections that can be made, and some of those connections have been made in the anti-war movement.
Right, and so the idea I'm getting is that historical legitimacy, which is always claimed by the ancient regime de jour.
Sure.
I mean, Louis XVI tried, and everybody would say we are legitimate, and they are not. That is beginning to be eroded. I think possibly, certainly on an international scale, we have such enmity directed against us because we are not conceived. We're not seen in the legitimate order that we tend to see ourselves. The idea of Vietnam, we had a trouble. They kept putting in new troops. We had Tonkin Road. We put in 500,000. Is there a fear on your part? Your book is about is there an analogy between what happened in Iraq? We made a mistake in Vietnam. Could we go along that same disastrous camp? Mr. Bush, it looked unhinged to me when he said, we're going to stay the course in Iraq, we're going to win, that sort of thing, against all the empirical evidence and so forth.
Yep.
What do you think?
No, there's absolutely, all the signs indicate that they're going to persist in this imperial folly the same way they did with the Vietnam War. We've already seen recently an analogous situation to the broadening of the Vietnam War to Laos and Cambodia, with the recent support of Israel's war in Lebanon, and beyond that, the threat of an attack on Iran,
which again came a
and an attack
cropper.
on Syria.
Which came a cropper.
Absolutely. But you go back to when the U.S. invaded Laos and Cambodia, that was after '68, after the Tet Offensive, when we now know the internal discussions in the U.S. military, top generals knew that the United States was losing. Rather than acknowledge that they were losing in retreat, they intensified the bombardment of Vietnam.
Is there a danger of that?
They expanded the war. There's absolutely a danger of that. In fact, there was talk earlier this year about, we're going to draw down troops. That was electioneering. In reality, they're sending more troops into Iraq, and they're intensifying what's called pacification programs. It's going to lead to more
pacification. We got to burn the village.
It's going to lead to more massacres. We've recently seen revelations about a massacre in Haditha, about a rape murder massacre in Mahmoudia. More and more of these things are coming out. In Abu Ghraib, they're not isolated. They're the logical outcome of an
And
occupation.
as this pressure mounts, then there's going to be more paranoia. There's going to be like he looked unhinged to me. Which is very worrisome because they got such. And then the thing in Vietnam, it came that way and everything, and we finally ended up. And we were fighting a force that could not be. We cannot. Even Mr. McCain will say we cannot lose because what's going to be lost. They said the same thing in Vietnam. It's commies.
We can't
will be
lose.
in San Francisco. We can't lose. They're feeling the same kind of thing now. And now the thing in Hezbollah, and that was to be a forerunner to get rid of Hezbollah and whip the wogs in Lebanon and that sort of thing, and then we will be able to be free to attack Iran because they have enough time. So that's another dimension of expanding it and expanding the neocons' cry for war, war, war against these people that we have to. It's got a colonial tinge to it. We got to whip them into shape and show them who's boss.
Absolutely.
You think that's in the wind?
That's definitely
worrisome.
It's very worrisome, and if you think about it, much more is at stake for the United States in Iraq than was at stake in Vietnam. Vietnam was much less strategically positioned in terms of world geopolitics than Iraq is. Vietnam didn't have the world's second largest oil reserves, or third largest oil reserves, which Iraq does. It wasn't next to a state which had the world's second or third largest oil reserves, Iran, and which has the world's second largest natural gas reserves. It wasn't in a region with 2/3 of world oil. It also is the case, historically speaking, that the U.S. said, going into Iraq, we're going to eliminate the Vietnam syndrome. They thought once and for all we're going to bury this criticism, this skepticism about Vietnam.
We were wrong.
And now the opposite is happening. Rather than burying the Vietnam syndrome and giving this beautiful glow to humanitarian, quote-unquote, intervention,
can be drawn.
It's going the opposite way. It's delegitimizing American imperial power rather than legitimizing it. So a defeat in Iraq is much worse than a defeat in Vietnam from the standpoint of the very narrow interests of people like Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush and the people who run the empire. And so they don't care how many more U.S. soldiers die. They don't care how many more Iraqis die. They don't care if they've got to break up that country and foment civil war, which they are doing right now. They will do that until the point at which they conclude it's detrimental to their economic, political, and military interests.
And it may be the world is going to bring that about sooner than they might want to think. We didn't want to get out of Vietnam at the time, and it was the last neocon to come from the roof of the Saigon embassy or something like that. And it's a very worrisome thing. Your book lays out, it's called The Logic of Withdrawal. It's laid out, and it couldn't be more highly recommended. It's very, very well written. I wonder, though, we have a little clip, and people may not have seen it, of the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad. He was talking with Mike Wallace in 60 Minutes.
60 Minutes.
A couple of 3 minutes. Some people may not have seen it. I wonder if maybe it might be worth running. We could run that now.
Sure.
And show this little clip to introduce you. It's just 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll come back. We're talking with Anthony Arnove, Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal, his book, very highly recommended. But maybe we could...
Well, I wanted to open a window towards the light for the president, so that he can see that one can look on the world through different perspectives. All are free to choose. We are all free to choose. But please give him this message, sir. Those who refuse to accept an invitation to good will not have a good ending or fate.
What does that mean?
Well, you see that his approval rating is dropping every day. Hatred vis-a-vis the president is increasing every day around the world. For a ruler, this is the worst message that he could receive. Rulers and heads of government at the end of their office must leave the office holding their heads high.
How long has it been
the people
since...
must continue to love them once they leave the office.
How long has it been since the leaders of Iran and the leaders of the U.S. have had any conversations?
26, 27 years.
Do you have the least desire to resume relations with the United States?
Should we do that?
Do you have that desire?
Who cut the relations, I ask you?
That's not the point. The question is, would you, the president of Iran, like to resume relationships which have been gone for 26, 27 years with the United States?
Well, we are interested to have relations with all governments and all nations.
Please
this
answer.
Is the principle of my foreign policy.
I know that.
Allow me to finish my thought.
Why don't you just answer, say yes or no?
Well, okay, they cut it off. There was a little bit more that we could have put in there, but that's just a look at him. He's the man on the spot in a certain sense. Hezbollah, they claim in support, $100 million are going for those Katyusha rockets, and that the rise of Nasrallah and that sort of thing in the region is shaping perhaps a new dimension in terms of claims to historical legitimacy is what I was trying to get at. And do you think the claim to superpower Israeli capability and superpower United States capability may be chipped away at and begin to be chipping away at their assumption in their language of historical legitimacy, maybe making way for something that's dialogue of a nature that might be able to move over toward a human condition that you and I might more appropriately approve of? Or
well, you have a dilemma, which is that Iran is now being condemned publicly because it's saying that it might at some point in the future develop a nuclear weapon. It doesn't have one. It's probably 5, 10 years, if not longer, away from having one single nuclear weapon. That's creating furor in the world, an outrage, complete, paranoia in the press.
We have 10,000.
We have 10,000 now. It's a little bit lower in terms of active warheads.
That's okay.
Israel, fine, no one wants to talk about that. Israel has more than 200 nuclear weapons. Israel is not a signatory to the non-proliferation treaty.
The same.
Pakistan is not a signatory to the non-proliferation treaty, another ally of ours in the so-called war on terror. India, not a member of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So you have a situation where other countries in the world, especially after what just happened in Iraq, where they look at Iraq and they see that Iraq was attacked not because it had weapons of mass destruction, but because it didn't. So what we've done is the United States has fueled a global race toward developing a deterrent to U.S. power, which means we fueled a global arms race, a global nuclear arms race. It's profoundly dangerous, destabilizing.
Absolutely.
It's going to lead to a situation where there's a greater chance of military conflict in the Middle East, greater conflict of nuclear war. At the same time, it raises the stakes for those of us who have a different vision of a future without nuclear weapons, without war, without billions of dollars going to build weapons of mass destruction when people could be clothed, fed, and housed with those resources.
Perhaps with a vision that would be able to serve the human interests of us all in a liberating way, which may be the real test that we have to come up with. And one of the things that we have to deal with is this new situation that's emerging, and you can't do better, if I may suggest, than getting to this book, and this is by our author. We've run out of time, sorry, Anthony Arnove, and it is, what's it called,
The Logic of Withdrawal.
The Logic of Withdrawal, which Mr. Bush is not in agreement with you on that, unfortunately, but he might do well to read this book, as we all might. And thank you very much, Anthony, for coming in. Great pleasure talking to you. Best to Mr. Zinn. He's a great hero of a great many of us, and it's your pleasure to have had the perceptions of Anthony, and we invite you to tune in when we come back again tomorrow. We just sort of scratched the surface of a very big subject, but you've really done a beautiful job with this book, and I congratulate you on it very much.
Thank you.
We'll be coming back again tomorrow, so please tune in. So anyway, we got onto some of it.